Hello everyone, my name is Abhijato Sensarma and the title of my piece is The Sudden Introspections of Borge Isoue. It was in the middle of October when Borge Isoue realized his job meant little to him. This enlightenment wasn't inspired by one of those articles published in a hip online magazine that said clever things about late-stage capitalism. Neither had he picked up a book or seen a clip of a motivational speaker about how one ought to love what they do so that they didn't have to work a single day in their life. Rather, he'd simply spent too much time working towards holding down a job so he wouldn't have to end up dependent on welfare like his father and remain open to criticism from better placed peers in society. And while he had no partner to go home to, he'd found stability to be a much more seductive goal to strive for. He was first a student, then an accountant, and finally, a man with enough debt incurred from the former occupation to engage him as the ladder for the rest of his days. His latest independent musing could be condensed into such. There must be more to life than plugging away at a worn-out keyboard the management's been apprehensive about replacing. At its core, the story is about an accountant who has a sudden realization that even though he's quite good at his job, he isn't necessarily the most passionate about it. So this leads to a series of interactions where he eventually ends up negotiating his future with an anthropomorphic goat and must question the basis of his identity before he can strike up a surrealist kind of a deal with this said goat. I think I was at a period of my artistic journey where I wanted to do something different from the stories I'd written so far. Earlier, even when I delved into genres like fantasy or science fiction, I made the effort to be grounded in the commercial sensibilities of specifically the West when I had grown up reading genre fiction throughout most of my teenage years. But I had also been a fan of Haruki Murakami's writings for the longest time. And his writings carry a simplicity but also a deeper truth, and his magical realist imagery is quite defiant to the norms of the usual blockbuster authors, even though he's one too. And that was quite intriguing for me. So I wanted to create something in a similar genre. I've always been conscious of trying to avoid mimicking any author I'm fascinated by and tried to stick to my own voice within this new arena. But I still tried to do something different, and even though I can't be the judge of my piece, I hope that this process was as therapeutic to the readers as it was to me because of the different approach I took with the story. Something that's always worked for me is to keep the emotional core of the story at the center of any scene. Any memorable narrative event, so as to speak, has some form of conflict embedded into it. So instead of focusing on the spectacle of an awesome idea, at least when I've tried this, it's turned out to be quite overwhelming most of the time. I've tried to emphasize on the nature of the conflict itself. This is not to say that it should always be at the forefront over the other elements of a narrative in the finished product. However, whenever I've crafted the rest of the elements, including the setting, dialogue, pacing, and so on and so forth, while keeping in mind the conflict's nature in my mind, the end product has always been a satisfying narrative event for me. I think it took me about 2 or 3 days to get through the story. Because the style of the story was so different, I took more time than usual. But again, I tried to keep the fact that this protagonist is struggling with his inner thoughts and tried to manifest it through this anthropomorphic goat, even though it doesn't make too much realistic sense on the surface level. So trying to get that balance right was the toughest part for me. Maybe it's because I come from a school of thought where minimalism is held in a divine light. But I feel a story which tries to do the most behind the scenes is always the most successful at being accessible to everyone while also being memorable. I have noticed most people relatively new to the practice, including me, fall into the trap of using purple prose as a substitute for having actual depth in the story. On the other hand, letting the audience at least know just the things they need to know, while also making the story readable for people across a spectrum of the audience, is a challenge, but it is effective in helping one develop one's writing muscles. And at the end of the day, short stories are a great way to do so. Another thing to realize is perhaps that this form of fiction also allows a leeway longer forms don't, such as novels. While it's a truth that almost all the art we produce is kind of overwhelming at the end, no matter what stage we are at in our writing, I think the fact that short stories take less effort to write, and the fact that they will often not be for everyone and sometimes not for anyone, isn't as much a curse in my mind as it is a blessing. So my advice to any fellow writers out there would be to experiment as much as they can and write as often as they can, because I've done that and I think I've greatly benefited from it. And while some stories we write will turn out to be things we cannot ever show anyone else, I think there will also be diamonds hidden in the rough for us to cherish forever. Considering the discussion we have had so far, I think it would be appropriate to bring up a story by Murakami himself. It's called Blind Willow Sleeping Woman, and it's from a recently published book translated into English of the same name. And while it's quite difficult to summarize the story, and this would ordinarily be a negative, I think but in this case, I think the genius of the story is that it sets out to evoke a highly specific emotion, characteristic of Murakami's work, that cannot be done justice in just a few lines. But it's also a perfect summarization of what his approach to story writing, and particularly short story writing, is all about. And the entire collection has a narrative which is quite satisfying to follow. And for any introductory readers, it's also a great peek into magical realism, at least the kind he writes. While there is no inherent plot conflict within the story according to the Western sensibilities I was talking about, it also brings out the best tendencies of short stories to be an avenue for exploration of emotions and emotional conflicts. He keeps the core of the story in the subtext through the various emotions and the nostalgic, isolatory feelings the protagonist is going through. But all these form the rest of the elements of the story, and I think that's what makes this product of his craft so exemplary in my eyes. I had a great experience working with you, the founder of Samjoko Magazine, and Todd, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to appear on this edition of your show. And I think the first edition of the magazine was exemplarily done because there was no strict genre or style you decided to stick to, and the end result was all the richer for it. And I wish you all the best and all the luck for your future endeavors.